With a new college football season quickly approaching, it is time for me to give my predictions for the college football playoffs. However, like many things in college football, things will be different in the winter, when only the best teams remain. Instead of just 4 teams qualifying for college football's postseason, now that number will increase to 12. Here's a quick summary of how those new playoffs will work. The 5 highest ranked conference champions will qualify for the college football playoff, along with the next 7 highest ranked teams. The selection committee will determine these rankings. The 4 best conference champions will receive first round byes in the first 4 seeds. The 5th conference champion will either be ranked among the other 8 teams or the number 12 spot if they are unranked. The first round starts in December, and the teams ranked 5 through 8 will have a home game during the first round. The quarterfinals and semifinals will be played at traditional bowl games. There will be no reseeding as teams compete for a spot in the national championship in Atlanta. Since that's out of the way, let's start with who I think will finish as the best team in the country, Georgia. There's really no questions with this one. If there was an expanded playoff last year, they easily would have made it. They really only missed because there's only 4 teams, and they had a last week loss to Alabama, which prevented them from getting in. They have Carson Beck returning at quarterback, so even though they're losing players like Ladd McConkey, Brock Bowers, this program is just so good, it's not even going to hurt them that much, and they're going to be right back in the playoff contention, in the national championship contention once again. I do think they're slightly better than Ohio State, and while the SEC is competitive as always, and I think Texas will give them a real fight for the SEC championship, I think they're just a better team, and I think they're going to ultimately take not only the SEC championship again this year, and I think they'll also take the number 1 spot in the entire country in the playoffs as well. So I think this Georgia team, as always, this defense could be really good. One of the best, if not the best, in the entire country. And Kirby Smart, he knows how to win. He knows how to win in the playoffs. He's won a national championship before, 2 of them, and now he doesn't have to deal with Nick Saban anymore. So I have a really hard time seeing this team not winning the SEC championship and the national championship, and I just see no scenario where they miss the playoffs. I just can't see that happening, and I think they're the number 1 team in the nation. They're the best team in the nation. Then another super easy, kind of boring prediction here. Ohio State at number 2. They still got a ton of talent. They brought in a ton of transfers. This could very well be the most talented team in the country, ahead of Georgia. They have Will Howard coming in at quarterback, who I think is an upgrade. They still have that defense, a lot of which is returning. They're bringing in Quinshon Judkins from Ole Miss and Caleb Downs from Alabama at cornerback. So I think there's a lot of improvements they've already made to this roster, which are already more than capable of making a national championship run, a Big Ten championship run, which those upgrades were necessary, though, because they do have some really tough games this year at Oregon, at Penn State. They could very well lose both those games, but they're still very much going to have a chance to not only win the Big Ten championship, but the national championship, even if they lose those 2 games. It's less of a question about if they make the playoffs, it's more of a question of where they are. And there is a scenario where they do lose both those games, and then maybe it's Penn State and Oregon in the championship. That's the worst case scenario, but I still think they would get in the playoffs then. And I think this team, at best, can definitely win the national championship. At number 3, I'm going with Miami, and I know a lot of people say it's either going to be Florida State or Clemson for the ACC champion, but I think it's going to be Miami. I like what Mario Cristobal's building down there. I think Cam Ward's really going to help them. He can give them just enough to get over teams like Florida State, Clemson. And while I don't think he'll win the Heisman or anything, I still think he can give Miami what they need to not only win the ACC, but maybe compete even for a national championship. What's different about them compared to the other teams already mentioned, Georgia and Ohio State, is winning the ACC is really important for them. They still could get in if they don't win the ACC, but winning the ACC is definitely got to be their main focus because it's going to be a lot harder for them to get in compared to Georgia or Ohio State if they do not win their conference. And the biggest thing for this Miami team is they got to win. And Florida, week 1, that's a really tough game for week 1. And the reality is Florida has a really tough schedule. So the likelihood of them being good and that being a quality win, that the committee looks at and gives them a little more favorability. It's not super likely, so Miami just needs to get the win. And then they do get Florida State at home, which is definitely going to help, not having to go to Florida State in that home crowd. So I definitely think that Miami, if they can get past Florida, or even if they lose to Florida, but if they at least beat Florida State and have a shot at the ACC's championship game, I think they're in a really good position to get the number 3 spot. And the reality is they also just got to finish games. Last year they were really close in a lot of games. They made some mistakes they probably shouldn't have at the end of games. But I think they're going to learn from it, and that's why I have them here at number 3. The Big 12 is very much the same way. You have teams like Utah, Arizona, Kansas State, Oklahoma State, even Colorado that are all very good, can win the conference. But at the end of the day, I think the 2 teams that are the most likely to win the Big 12 and get this automatic playoff spot are Utah and Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State obviously is Ollie Gordon, who's arguably the best running back in the entire country. And so he gives Oklahoma State a massive advantage. And overall, just Oklahoma State has been a very consistently good program. And now with Texas and Oklahoma leaving, I think that definitely gives them some sort of advantage because they've been in the Big 12 for a long time. Now that they've left, I think that kind of makes them the favorite in a way. But I also think that Utah has been successful in the Pac-12 for a very long time. And I don't see that success going away anytime soon. And they're bringing back Cameron Rising for another season. And I think Utah does win the Big 12 championship here. I think this will be a very close contest between all these teams because there's a lot of good teams in this conference. And I would not be surprised if whoever wins this conference surprises people and makes a run for the national championship. And even though I do only have one team from the Big 12 making it, I still think it's very possible for more teams from the Big 12 to make it. But for now, Utah is the one and only team from the Big 12. So that's the last conference champion team for now. So all the teams from now on will be playing in the first round. And starting off with Oregon, you could really put a lot of different teams here. There's Texas, there's Alabama, there's Ole Miss, just to name a few. At this point, you can really kind of put any team wherever. It's so close with a lot of these teams. It's so unpredictable. There's a lot of great games, especially this year, where it's just so close. And it's just really hard to predict. But I do have Oregon here. I think out of the remaining teams, I do think Oregon is probably the best left. I think Dan Lanning's got probably his best team yet here at Oregon. And I think that with Dylan Gabriel coming to Oregon too, I think that makes a huge difference. And right now, I think he is the favorite to win the Heisman Trophy. And Oregon has a long history of successful quarterbacks. It was Marcus Mariota, then Justin Herbert, and now it's Bo Nix. We still got to see how his career goes in the NFL. But, I mean, Oregon knows what they're doing, and I think if there's any year they can win their first national championship, this could very well be the year. They have some huge games, whether it's Ohio State. That is at home, though. But at the same time, they can definitely lose a game, maybe even 2, and still get in the national championship, still get in the Big Ten championship. I still think this team is very capable of doing any of those things. Oregon does have, in some ways, a major advantage here, being the 5 seed, because they get to play the 12 seed, which is the lowest ranked conference champion. Because remember, the lowest ranked conference champion either gets ranked with the other teams or becomes the 12th seed if they're unranked. So in this case, Oregon does benefit from that. And it also helps them in the next round too, because they get to face the number 4 seed, which is better than facing, obviously, the number 1 or number 2 seed. So Oregon is in a very good spot here, and the 5 seed in general is a good spot. At number 6, I have Texas. I strongly considered putting them ahead of Oregon, but ultimately I decided I just think Oregon is the better team, but Texas does go here. The SEC is going to be very competitive, as always. I do think Georgia is better than them, but I think Texas has improved enough to where I feel comfortable putting them ahead of Alabama and Ole Miss. But Texas, they got some tough games, just like pretty much every SEC school does this year in their first season in the SEC. But they're bringing back Quinn Ewers, bringing in guys like Isaiah Bond from Alabama. So I really have no doubts this Texas team will return to the playoffs. They're so close last year to going to the national championship. So I just think it's really hard to see them not making it. Of course, in the SEC, it's really tough to keep winning, especially when you have Georgia, Alabama, Ole Miss in your conference. But I think the committee's going to understand that, and I think they can definitely get away with a few losses and not even being a conference champion and still get in the playoffs and still be a 6 seed, which is very high. And I think this Texas team is more than capable of competing for a national championship this season. They do play Georgia in Texas, though, so that could be their chance to maybe get an advantage over Georgia, especially because they don't play Alabama or Ole Miss this year. At number 7, it's Alabama, and the reality is that even though they lost Nick Saban, it's still Alabama. Even though they lost some players, they still got Jalen Milroe coming back, and this team is still talented, probably easily actually a top 5 team in terms of overall talent. And even though they still have Georgia and Texas and Ole Miss in their conference, I still think it's very hard for them to miss the playoffs. I just think this team's too talented, and Kalen DeBoer, even though he's definitely not Nick Saban, he still got Washington in the playoffs last year, and he got the national championship last year as well. So I don't see them not making the playoffs, really, and that's why I have them pretty high overall. I think you can definitely make an argument that this is a little too high, maybe, and that they could be a little bit lower on this list, but I just don't see them not making the playoffs because at the end of the day, they're still Alabama, and they're still going to win a lot of games. Then at number 8, after Alabama, I have Ole Miss. Some people think they're going to be in the playoffs, some people don't. I do believe Ole Miss is a very good team. I would say probably 3rd best, 4th best maybe in the SEC. I do have them behind Alabama, though, just because I still want to just see a little bit more from them. Obviously, Alabama's been super consistent. Ole Miss is just starting to get really good, so I put them behind Alabama for now. But it's still Lane Kiffin, it's still Jackson Dart. I know they lost Quinshon Judkins, which is obviously not going to help them, but I still think Ole Miss can be a very good team. I still think they're an SEC championship contender, a national championship contender. I think they proved that last year in I think it was the Peach Bowl last year against Penn State. Those are 2 very good teams, and Ole Miss proved they're the better one, at least in that game. And I think that shows what they're capable of. I don't think they're quite at the level of the Georgias and the Texas teams yet, but I do think they can definitely compete with Alabama and can maybe compete for a national championship as well. Next up at number 9, it is Notre Dame. And I actually think Notre Dame may benefit more than any other team from this expanded playoff because in the 4-team playoff, the reality is that conference championships are very important, and that was a big factor in the committee's decision of who to put in and who to leave out. And Notre Dame doesn't have a conference to play in, a conference championship to play in, and that really hurt them in a lot of cases. But now that it matters less, obviously they can't get a bye because they are not in a conference. But in this case, it does actually help them because even though they obviously can't get a top 4 seed, they still don't have to play in that conference championship game, which gives them a little bit of extra rest. It also allows them to play a little bit of an easier schedule. So as long as they can win some of their closer games they have to play this year, they should get in, and they should be, at least in my opinion, around a 9 seed. I think there's a lot of questions around Notre Dame still. How will Riley Leonard do in his first season after transferring from Duke? But overall, I think Marcus Freeman does have this team going in the right direction. I do think they get a playoff spot. And I think Penn State finally makes the playoffs at number 10. This defense is going to be good once again. They have a great player in Abdul Carter still in that defense. We do have to see how Drew Aller continues to develop and lead that offense. But overall, this is a very good Penn State team. They're usually in this spot at the end of the season where they're good, but just not good enough to make the playoffs. But obviously, as the playoff expands, I think that changes. And I think they do have enough to get in the playoffs and even make a run. But they do have a very big game against Ohio State. And I think that could have a huge role in deciding who plays in the Big Ten Championship, which obviously if they do play in that game could have an impact in the ranking. Their schedule for the most part is a lot easier than a team like Michigan, so I do trust them a little more to get to this playoff spot. than a team like Michigan. And even though I don't think Florida State does win the ACC championship, I do think they still get a playoff spot. They were so close last year. Probably the most controversial playoff spot last year in the history of the modern college football playoff. And they didn't get it, but I think this year they do. Obviously, they lost quarterback Jordan Travis from last year and some other players as well. But they have brought in DJ Uyunglele from Morgan State, and I think he has improved a lot. And I think he can definitely lead this Florida State Seminoles team to compete at a high level. And even though I think that Miami is going to be slightly better and Clemson will be good too, I still think they get this playoff spot. And that they can still be very competitive and they can still compete for a national championship, even if they aren't exactly as good as they were last year. And finally, I do have Boise State taking this 12th and final spot in the college football playoff. It could honestly go to them, Liberty, or Memphis, in my opinion. I think those are the three top contenders right now. Although I think I give Boise State the slight advantage here because their conference is probably the strongest, and I think the committee will respect that. So if it is really close, which I think it will be, I do give them the advantage. And also I think they have a really good player in Ashton Jeanty, who is among the best running backs in the country, like Judkins and Gordon. So those are my college football playoff predictions, and I will be making part 2 where I actually go through the playoff matchups and give my predictions for who wins and the eventual national champion. So make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss that video. But just a quick recap of the matchups. It will be Oregon and Boise State, then Texas and Florida State, followed by Alabama and Penn State, and then the 8 seed Ole Miss versus the 9 seed Notre Dame. And then just to quickly recap some of the teams I didn't include in this list. Michigan obviously is the defending champion. You can make a very strong argument for why they should be here. I mostly didn't include them because of how hard their schedule is. They got to face Texas. They got to go to Washington. They have Ohio State, obviously. I just think that's a really tough schedule, and I think they would have to be almost perfect to put themselves in a good position to get in the playoffs. But this is definitely one of the most talented teams you can find out there in college football. They got players like Mason Graham and Will Johnson on defense, and Sherrone Moore has proven himself to be a very good coach already. I just think the schedule is a little too tough, and I think Michigan just misses the playoffs. Then with Missouri, I think they have a very talented team. Obviously, Luther Burden is going to be one of the top receivers in college football and one of the top players in general. And they obviously had a very impressive win in the Cotton Bowl against Ohio State, where I think is the second best team, maybe even the first best team in the country. But I just think the SEC just has so many good teams, and I just trust Georgia and Texas and Alabama and Ole Miss more right now. But I could very easily see Missouri in the playoffs. Then with LSU, I just think it's going to be very difficult to replace Gene Daniels. There's a lot of talent on that team, though. So, again, just the SEC is so competitive. I just think I trust the other 4 teams I've already mentioned a little bit more. And then the same is true for Tennessee. Again, very talented team. A lot of good players. Just I trust the other teams I've already put in the playoffs a little bit more. And then with basically all the Big 12 teams, it's so competitive there. I could see a lot of different teams making it. Again, I just trust Utah the most. I think they've been the most consistent. And if not them, I'd probably say Oklahoma State. But again, you can see maybe a Kansas State, an Arizona, a lot of different options. Then just quickly looking at the odds here. Every team, all 12, I did have in the playoffs, except 2, which is LSU and Michigan, and also no Miami or Utah. So I guess that's kind of a bold take by me, but I guess everyone is not as confident in those 2 teams as I am. However, similar to my list, though, Georgia is the favorite to win the national championship. And like I said, I am making a part 2 of this video where I will be making my playoff predictions and go game by game and eventually predicting the national champion. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.